and welcome to The Language of Power, a podcast brought to you by the European Policy Centre's Europe in the World programme. Every 2 weeks, we bring you insight on the latest geopolitical developments, how they affect Europe, and how Europe can affect them. I'm Paul Taylor, Senior Visiting Fellow at the EPC, and I'll be your host on these deep dives into global and European politics and security. Today, we're going to look at Europe's response to the war unleashed by the United States and Israel against Iran. 4 weeks into the conflict, the Europeans are still struggling to find a common position or to exert any influence on the course of a war they didn't want and about which they weren't consulted. Europe is a collateral victim of this war, with higher energy prices already, the risk of a wider spike in inflation and lower economic growth, and a heightened terrorism threat, plus a possible new refugee crisis, notably due to Israel's simultaneous war on Hezbollah in Lebanon. When the bombing began, European leaders reacted very differently. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez denounced the US-Israeli operation as a violation of international law. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer refused to let the US use British bases for the initial attack on Iran. On the other hand, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen endorsed the objective of regime change in Iran without any criticism of the US-Israeli action. They condemned only Iranian retaliation against Gulf states, Israel, and a UK base in Cyprus. Cyprus, of course, is an EU member, and member states rallied around it, sending warships and aircraft to show their support and to intercept any future missiles. The war has brought into the open a more fundamental clash between the EU's interests and its values. Von der Leyen said Europe can, quote, no longer be a custodian of the old world order for a world that has gone and will not return. We will always defend and uphold the rules-based system that we helped build with our allies, she said, but we can no longer rely on it as the only way to defend our interests or assume that its rules will shelter us from the complex threats that we face. The Commission President quotes a more realistic and interest-driven foreign policy and the means to deliver on it. The President of the European Council, on the other hand, Antonio Costa, contradicted her the next day, saying that the US must defend the rules-based international order and not accept violations of international law, whether it was be in Ukraine, Greenland, Latin America, Africa, Gaza, or the Middle East. Meanwhile, the person who's actually supposed to conduct the EU's common foreign and security policy, High Representative Kaja Kallas, said bluntly that this is not Europe's war, articulating the refusal of EU countries to help Donald Trump reopen the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's oil and gas exports pass, at least as long as the war continues. So where do Europe's interests and values really lie in this conflict? More generally, what is the right balance between interests and values in the EU's relations with third countries? For example, between energy needs, human rights, and democracy in ties with states such as Azerbaijan or Qatar, or between climate policy and trade benefits in relations with Indonesia or Brazil? Has the EU handicapped itself by taking the moral high ground where others, notably the United States and China, have pursued their interests more ruthlessly, for example, in Africa? Well, who better to discuss these issues than my special guest today, Fabian Zuleeg, Chief Executive and Chief Economist of the European Policy Centre, and hence my boss, and one of the most respected, constructive critics of EU policies and operating methods. Fabian, welcome to The Language of Power. Let me start by asking you, what do you think was going through the minds of European leaders as they responded to the news of the US-Israeli attack on Iran? Were they saying to themselves, well, Trump and Netanyahu are really doing the right thing, but we daren't say so too loud because such unilateral military action without a UN mandate breaches all our principles? Or were they thinking, our overriding interest is just to keep the Americans engaged on our side in European security, and especially in Ukraine, if possible? So however much we may think this is wrong and may end badly, we mustn't say anything that alienates Trump from European security. Fabian, which one was it?
I think it's very difficult to say because, as usual, we have lots of different thoughts going through different leaders' minds. I wouldn't expect that everybody had the same reaction. I would also think that to some extent it is all these different, sometimes contradictory thoughts happening at the same time. I would also think that when we're talking about this particular situation, that this is, of course, not only about Iran, about what is happening in the Middle East, but it is about everything. Everything is now interconnected. I think one of the most common reactions, not only among leaders, will just simply be, okay, this is the next thing. This is part of this barrage of initiatives, of actions taken by Donald Trump, which have frankly made it very difficult for people to find their feet. And the Europeans have struggled to react because part of the strategy of President Trump is to dominate the agenda, to dominate the news, to be the person who dictates what is being talked about. And he certainly managed to do that again with Iran. But I think there will also have been a more nuanced thought. Yes, to some extent, there's a universal condemnation of the Iran regime. There's a clear-cut understanding that the Middle East is unstable and that action might be necessary. But I think there's also real fear of the repercussions, which we've actually seen was a justified fear, because we have seen that the consequences of this, both within the war and beyond the war, are rather unpredictable and are already having negative impacts also on Europe.
So what do you see as Europe's overriding interest in this conflict? And how should it go about trying to secure those interests? Even if the Europeans didn't want this war, should they bear the cost and responsibility of reopening the Strait of Hormuz once the fighting stops? Because Europe, after all, and its partners need the energy supplies?
I think we should look at these kind of geoeconomic, geopolitical questions from the value perspective, from the interest perspective, but also from what I've called imperatives. What are the things we are going to have to do as Europeans within this much more challenging environment which we're finding ourselves? I think what is, for me, very clear, and if you actually look at some of the more nuanced comments we have had at the member state level, once there is some form of ceasefire, it is, in my view, no question that Europeans are going to be involved. The Strait of Hormuz is too important for Europe to just simply leave to whatever forces are there. That does not mean getting involved in the war, because I think there's a very real appreciation of our leaders that this is deeply unpopular with all of our populations. So the idea that, for example, a ship of a European Navy could be sunk, that soldiers could be killed, this is something, in my view, no government would survive in Europe. So they are not going to get involved in this hot phase of the war, but they will have to get involved in the consequences. What Europe also has experienced, and this is part of US policy, is that we have to pay for things. And we are going to have to continue paying, even if you can argue that we were not involved at the beginning of this. But at the very least, we are going to be deeply affected by the oil price changes, the energy price changes, which we are already seeing. And actually, we have to recognize that this is, again, a long-term structural change. It is not just simply something which flares up now and will stop again. Even in the best of all cases, we are going to see that the energy market will be tighter. We will see already, and again, this is also the cross-connection to some of the other imperatives we have. We already see this is going to have a profound impact on Ukraine's war against Russian aggression. So all of it is connected, and the Europeans will always be, in the end, the ones who will have to pay the price.
Yeah. I'll come on to Ukraine in a second, but first of all, let's stick with Iran. Should the Europeans be seeking regime change in Iran? And what more could they do to help Iranians who do want to overthrow the Islamic Republic system? It took a massacre of protesters in January for the EU to finally declare the Islamic Republican Guard Corps a terrorist organization after years of indecision. Do such actions actually make any difference, or are they just virtue signaling?
We need to be very clear that this idea that somehow we could choose, I think, is an illusion which is dangerous. Even the United States doesn't seem to be able to choose regime change because we're not seeing at this moment in time that the Iranian opposition is rising, is able to capitalize on this. And that's also because, and I think this is something we should have learned from history, just because a regime is very unpopular, it does not mean that they welcome the interference from outside, welcome also, frankly, the military action from outside. We've already seen, for example, that sanctions can be counterproductive because they can actually be what brings the country together rather than what actually leads to regime change. So I think we need to be much more evidence-based in our thinking, and we have to learn from history in that. Yes, Europe could have done more. And I think these are not just symbolic gestures, because they also come with consequences, or at least they should come with consequences. If organizations are declared as terrorists, then that should have implications for financing. It should have implications for what kind of goods they can acquire on the open market. So yes, we should be doing these things, and we should be doing them more coherently. But we should also not have the illusion that these kind of things are what changes a regime in a country like Iran. That is just simply not realistic.
Well, the EU often gets accused, especially in the so-called global south, of double standards in its foreign policy. It condemns Russia's unilateral attack on Ukraine, but not the unilateral US-Israeli attack on Iran. It imposes sanctions over human rights violations by Russia and others around the world, but not on Israel over its behavior in Gaza and the West Bank. Are double standards simply part of the kind of realist foreign policy that Ursula von der Leyen was talking about, or does the EU need to do something to restore its credibility?
It's important to note that double standards are not a preserve of the West. This is something we observe everywhere. Countries are very keen to call out double standards when they happen elsewhere. They're not so keen to be self-critical, which is a normal part of foreign policy. But I think there is some truth in what Europe has been accused of. And I think in part this is because we continue to have one rhetoric, and when the reality then clashes with that rhetoric, it creates an easy point of attack for those who want to criticize the European Union. I think we should be far more direct when it comes to certain issues. I think that, yes, when we look at Ukraine, when we look at Russia's aggression, of course, there are values involved, and these are global values. We're talking here about the UN Charter. But we should also be realistic enough to know that doesn't buy very much in the global environment at this point in time. I think when it comes to that kind of aggression, the threat which we see not just to Ukraine, but to the whole of Europe, then, and that's coming back to what I just was talking about, then we should talk about imperatives. This is Europe's security, full stop. And no country in the world would tolerate the kind of attacks we have seen, the hybrid warfare which is already going on. The attack on Ukraine is a direct threat to our security, and we are going to respond to that threat. So I think in some areas we have to have that much more realistic foreign policy. We have to be much clearer about these imperatives which we are following. But then we also have to be differentiating when it comes to the Middle East. We also have to acknowledge that we are not a major actor within that environment. We are not going to be the ones who determine the outcomes. So we should be clear that we believe in certain principles, not for the sake of believing in principles, because we believe that in the long run, solutions will only be possible if we follow a certain, at least the guardrails of international foreign relations.
When we talk about imperatives, obviously one core imperative is the relationship with the United States, which has been through enormous turbulence since Donald Trump returned to the White House. How do you think the Europeans should recalibrate that relationship after last year's lopsided trade deal, which is only now working its way through the EU legislative sausage machine, and the NATO pledge to massively increase our defense spending? You just hosted the US ambassador to the EU. Did you come away thinking America is still our ally, or more of an adversary or a rival? How does it look?
We need to, of course, differentiate. Who are we talking about when we're talking about America? The current administration certainly has certain views of Europe, which are very different from other administrations we have seen. But I think we also have to distinguish between areas where I would say Europe has to act regardless of what happens in the United States, and how do we respond to the changing relationship with the United States. When we're talking about defense and security, it is true that the US is pushing us very hard to invest more money, to take our own responsibility much more seriously than we have in the past. But this is regardless of who sits in the White House, because the reason why we have to do this is because the threat from the East is very real, it's very present. We are going to have to do much more. However, that does not explain the actions of the US when it comes to issues such as Greenland, where we are seeing that there's a disdain for partnership, for alliance. It is very much America first. It does not explain what we have seen in the trade field, where it is about maximizing the economic gains for the US. And it is also not what we've seen in the ideological battle. This current government in the US does not believe in democracy as we have it in Europe, and is actively working with some of the opponents, if not the enemies of democracy within Europe. So we have to also adjust our response to these different realities. But in the end, we also have to start planning for what does Europe look like without the US. It might not happen, and I'm not saying it necessarily is a good thing if it happens, but we have to work with worst case scenarios. And even under the best circumstances, and that's bringing it back to Iran, we are already starting to see that when it comes to certain military technologies, it doesn't actually matter whether the US wants to continue to support Ukraine, wants to continue to support Europe, or doesn't, because these technologies are being used up in the Iran war. They simply will not be available for Europe. So we will have to do things in a very different way.
Yes, indeed. I wonder, final question for today. Does all this show that a common European foreign policy, we've spent 25 years, 35 years, and depending on when you calculate the starting gun, but at least 25 years trying to build this up with an external action service, with a high representative, and so on. But doesn't it show that this is in some way an impossible pipe dream? Or do you believe that the war in Ukraine shows that Europeans are capable of acting effectively together when they truly feel that their vital interests are threatened? It's just the rest of the time that they don't manage it.
We have to define what we mean by a common foreign policy. If we think we are going to have a common foreign policy similar to a nation state, that simply is not going to happen. We are going to stay for a long time, whether we think that's right or not, but we are a collection of different nations who all have their own foreign policy, who all have different interests, at times different values, at times different imperatives. So what we are going to see is that some of those differences persist. But that does not mean we can't have a common policy. It will not be an identical policy, but we can make sure that at the very least we coordinate more effectively. At the very least, we identify some areas where, as you were mentioning, we have a very broad common interest. But I think what we are starting to see, and this is not just in the foreign policy field, this is across all areas of European policy, and I'm saying very deliberately European, not EU, is that we are needing to work much more through coalitions of the willing, coalitions which are willing to go much further than what is happening at this moment in time. Because we are seeing that in many areas, it is not possible to move forward if there is the ability of 1, 2, 3 actors to block all the rest. So these coalitions of the willing, if they are designed well, can be a good way of moving forward. And they can also be a very good way of involving like-minded countries, and here I mean value-based like-minded countries who are wanting to go in the same direction, whether that's on economic security with countries like Canada, Australia, but also within the European security, where it does frankly make no sense if we talk about European security without also thinking about the UK, about Norway, and frankly about Ukraine, because in the end we are going to have to find a way of integrating Ukraine much closer into all of our structures than we have up to now.
Well, thanks very much, Fabian. I can't argue with that since it's something I've been advocating, including through the EPC since I joined. Thanks for joining me today. That's all we have time for this week, but you can find much more about all these topics on our website, www.epc.eu. The Language of Power will be back in 2 weeks' time with more debate and analysis on Europe's role in the world. I think next time we may look at Cuba and what Europe should do about Cuba, which the United States is currently trying to isolate, and where it also might be next on the regime change list. Until then, thanks to my colleague Simona Luswadi for helping to organize and record this podcast, and thank you for your listening. Goodbye.